Okay, on to our next set of questions. And this time, after the panelists have answered, I'll just go on directly to the subsequent set of questions without the intervening time with you. This has to do with politics. Countries vary not only with respect to culture or cultures, but also in terms of their political institutions, their political culture, the types of rulers who are in charge. Some are democratic countries, are open, encourage their own citizens to talk about political matters. Others are authoritarian, are closed, and if you were to talk about politics with a person there, might get yourself or that other person in trouble. So there's a tremendous variation in the types of these systems and in the vulnerability of yourself as a foreigner to being kicked out of the country at worst or arrested or something if you say or do something that is seen by the authorities as a threat. So what would be the appropriate behavior for an outsider in such a situation? What is inappropriate behavior? Should you, for example, if there's a rally going down the street in favor of freedom and all sorts of good things, should you join that rally, even if it's seen as an anti-governmental process? What would be the experience and advice of members of the panel?
So I made a point to read about Ugandan politics before I left. I read newspapers. When I was there, I toured government buildings, and I learned some things about the government that struck me as unfair or corrupt. It was really different from what goes on here. But it wasn't really my place to comment on these perceptions, because expressing those negative feelings towards local politics in front of Ugandans isn't really the norm there at all. Citizens don't typically criticize the government openly as much as we do here in America, and if I had done so, I could have been kind of ostracized from this group of students I was working with, and it could have really impacted my ability to work with government agencies on my project.
I never felt unsafe in any sense talking about politics. I just felt uncomfortable commenting on things since I knew I wasn't as knowledgeable as a lot of other people probably were. So, for example, one time I was in a classroom and a bunch of students asked what I thought of their president, and I just declined because I didn't want to just say things that I wasn't really knowledgeable about. But on the other hand, it was fine asking people questions. People were very opinionated in Argentina and wanted to talk about politics a lot. A conference I went to was like explicitly political. I went with my family as they voted in their hometown. A group I was with was organizing a protest. So as natural as it seemed and kind of in fitting with my research to engage in some of these, I was kind of reminded of the danger of getting too involved. Actually, when I was back, I saw in the newspaper one of the groups that I was meeting with, they were attacked in one of their protests. It had gotten fairly violent. So I would just say that even if it seems fairly relevant, just be aware that you don't want to get too involved in something like a protest, especially not at the expense of your safety, and it's hard to anticipate that. And then another thing that I wasn't anticipating and might be kind of relevant for some of you is the matter of university politics. I was with some university students who were of a party that was kind of against the political party of the municipality that they were in. And some of the students informed me that student politics and student government is actually really significant on a local and even a national level. So an event that we were at with the student party opposing the city government, it got shut down by city officials because they said that they do see them as kind of a political threat. So just realizing that in a lot of places, it might not seem that relevant, but student politics is definitely a player.
Yeah, I would just say as a blanket policy, and I think this goes for everywhere, not just West Africa, but I would avoid demonstrations and protests and marches just as a blanket policy. I think you guys all probably know this, but when you're in a foreign country, you're subject to their laws, even though you're an American citizen, or if you are an American citizen. So that would be the first point. The second would be certainly, register with your embassy. I had interned at an American embassy in Africa, so I knew the processes and various fallback plans. But you are entitled to a security briefing from the regional security officer if you want one. So I would certainly do that. And then I think you need to, with regard to discussing political institutions and society at large, it's just, judge the situation, and if you think it's something that the person would react, calmly and reasonably to, then you can ask about it. If not, then it's probably better to avoid it.
No?
Let me just jump in on that real quick, was that on the other side, people in some places are very openly critical of the government, which can align with some of your politics, cannot. Like in South Africa, they loved Obama, and our politics align more often than not, but sometimes, like, let's say there was this anarchist hip-hop group I was working with, and there was this anarchist vegan bookstore coffee shop that was delicious. So you kind of just have to be open to new ideas, because politics function differently in different places. And when I was open to hearing why people were fighting for this like anarchist platform, it started making sense in terms of how politics had disserviced them specifically in their lives and their communities. And it's a really good learning experience if you keep your mind open.
I think a point to make here is that while we call politics a sport in the United States, in other parts of the world it may not be a sport. It could be a blood sport, if you will. This is serious business. Governments feel threatened. The cost to you and to others with whom you speak could be high if you cross a certain boundary. So I think what you're hearing from the group in general is a certain sense of caution about expressing your own views. With political as well as with cultural sensitivity, I think a key point here might be to locate at least one person from the local culture, the local country itself, your age, somebody whom you can trust, with whom you become a friend. And when there are questions about what you should and shouldn't do culturally or politically, talk with that person on a regular basis. That is the most important source of information you can get, much better than anything you'll get from me or this panel or anybody at Stanford. A good friend locally with whom you can talk off record to tell you what to do and not to do would be very valuable, one of the first priorities, it seems to me, as you arrive in a new place. Let's turn to the question somewhat related to this, which is being perceived as an American. I know some of you are citizens of countries not the United States, but the fact that you've lived in this country, gone to Stanford, will identify you amazingly in whatever country you go as an American. How you walk, what your clothes are, a certain something about you. These guys can spot you a mile away as being an American, or at least being from the United States. And that in turn means they will come with certain images, certain stereotypes about Americans, about the behavior of American government, things they like, often things they do not like. And they will present you with, in negative cases, accusations that Americans are arrogant, they're know-it-all, they invade other countries and they don't want the Soviets to invade Crimea, but what did you do in Iraq, et cetera, so that you'll get a lot of criticisms of the United States and its policies, some of which you share and some of which you've never heard of before and think are a pack of lies. So what should you do when people perceive you as an American? Also, they perceive you as rich. You're made of money. You have to have money in order to have gotten here, so I want some of it. How do you deal with the reality of the perception that you come from one of the richest and most powerful countries in the world?
Yeah, I mean, to use a very pertinent example, in South Africa, no one would ever, even though Professor Abernathy told us to interrupt him if we miss someone, no one would ever stick up their hand at a professor and be like, oh, I have something to say, and interrupt them. That's a very American thing. So even like you may have your own ideas of what being American is. There's some things that are just ingrained in our culture in terms of like speaking out and being direct that I know I wasn't fully aware of until I went somewhere else and people were like, you're being very American right now, you know, you're very loud, you're out walking down the street and everybody can hear you. But there's also, I mean, there's a very narrow, at least where I was, there's a very narrow view of American culture that in some ways is very easy to get past because, I don't know, some people don't interact with Americans a lot, and a lot of it's based on, you know, music videos and the TV shows that they, like people I talk to have watched Flavor of Love or You know, these things are just flooding international television stations. So in some ways it can work to your benefit if you come and be like, well, I'm actually not like that. And then like they want to hear more from you because you've already gotten past their stereotype of what they thought you were going to be like. So I would encourage people to use that to their advantage and be like, well, let's kind of learn why you perceive me that way and what the media is doing in certain ways.
So I went to rural China, and I was in very poor, rural villages. So I really wanted to downplay my Americanness. I didn't really want to flash out hey, I'm American, I'm from a really privileged background, I go to Stanford. So I didn't mention any of that. I said that I was a student, I was Chinese, and that was basically it. So I tried to, say as little about my background as I could because I knew that that would influence my conversation with the locals. Might be a specific example in my case, but yeah.
In my case, being a hybrid of the two cultures brings a slightly different experience of being an American while I'm overseas doing research. On the one hand, if I walk through the streets of the city, somebody I don't know will look at how I'm built and how I walk and know which family I come from. At the same time, they'll also know just by how I'm dressed and the way I engage with people that I'm from America. And so there's that sort of split reality. The challenge of being perceived as as a St. Lucian from America, actually, is that I'm coming thinking I know everything. I've been Americanized, I've got the answers, and so I've arrived to tell you how things are done. So that's the biggest consideration I find when I go, is that I have to be really, really clear. I'm a researcher coming to understand what you think about things and perhaps add to the conversation, but I'm not here to impose some great, body of knowledge that I think that I have that you don't. So that's something that I keep quite aware of while I'm there.
So Argentina was kind of in unique economic circumstances with relation to the US because they had really strict regulation of American currency. Certain citizens were only allotted a certain amount of American dollars, so the exchange rate on the black market was way higher than official exchange rate. So as an American, the dollars were in really high demand. So I tried not to, even though it could be pretty advantageous for me to have American dollars, I was not trying to wave those around. And just like anywhere, when you're an American abroad, try not to be so obvious about it. But it's inevitable that you will be recognized as an American if you're someone like me. I definitely was called out all the time. And you get a lot of different receptions. There were a lot of people who were very receptive to me being from the US and would have a lot of kind of romanticized stereotypes. So that was always fun to be able to have conversations with people and kind of talk about maybe why I was different, maybe why the stereotypes existed. I also found that some of the people that I really wanted to interact with were a lot less receptive of me, especially being a North American. This tended to be with academics who were a lot more critical of me being there studying. Who am I to be studying something that they're an expert in? So even though I really had to justify why I was there and why my research was valid, it was also really good getting that critique from people because I think I learned a lot from it. I learned a lot about what kind of things I can be studying and what my strengths are. So that was, I'd be open to critiques of yourself as well.
When I interviewed people, I told them I was part of an American university when I asked for consent. And at the end of interviews, I thanked participants and gave them kind of a small, inexpensive item, usually a bar of washing soap or something. And a lot of times I was asked for more. I couldn't give more. It wasn't part of my budget. It wasn't part of the protocol. And I heard some stories, women who were telling me how they couldn't send their 8 kids to school, and those times were really uncomfortable. I sometimes had conversations, but I really couldn't offer anything more and had to walk away. So be prepared for things like that. I often carried around a bag of candy. I would meet kids everywhere, and they were really interested in what I was doing and would follow me around, and I loved just to be able to give them a little kind of token of friendship. But it gets a little bit tough when you kind of have to keep to a protocol for things like interviews.
Yeah, so I guess in the West African case, there's a much larger Western European presence there, particularly French. So oftentimes if you were Caucasian, you were just mistaken for French. So if that was the case, then I kind of just let that slide. But in the instances where I did identify myself as an American or interview people and they picked up on the fact that I was American, I think the largest challenge that I faced was being interpreted as either a spokesman or a representative somehow of the American government. And so oftentimes, I would have taxi drivers ask me if I could get them a visa to the United States, or I remember interviewing a refugee and her asking me as if I had a direct line to the president whether I could send American troops basically to Mali. So it was just kind of instances like that you should be prepared for and have a way to react to them that's both respectful and deferential to the person, but also brings the situation some clarity, I guess. So.
Thank you. From my own experience, oftentimes when I'm at home in this country, I'm quite critical of what my government does overseas. When I go overseas, I find quite amazingly that when somebody says the very same things about my government that I've just said at home, I get defensive. I, in a sense, wrap the flag around myself in a way that I would never do when I'm in this country. And you may find that experience, that suddenly you say, well, who are you to start criticizing my country? All of a sudden you become more of a patriot than you thought you were when you are here. You might also think, not necessarily of defending your country, even if that's your kind of reaction, but at least of explaining why it is we do certain things. So make this into a teachable and learnable moment, not necessarily, as I say, giving the reason why you think we should have done something, but the reason why we did, because that enables them to understand this country in a deeper way than just through the stereotypes. Why don't we just have a few minutes for you to think about what it is that you might be experiencing as Americans and how you might respond to that, followed shortly by the bell.